David Citadel in Jerusalem. Of course, we're here outside the new U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem 1 year after its opening just 1 year ago, May 14, 2018. Now, joining me and my colleague, Ami Kaufman, here we have two guests to break down the impact of this move some 1 year after this unprecedented and controversial move. Joining me, former Deputy Director for Foreign Policy and International Affairs from the National Security Council at the Israeli Prime Minister's office, Colonel in the Reserves, Eran Lerman, and Director of Development at the Mitvim Institute, Gayle Meyers. A pleasure to have you both with us.
Thank you.
Now, of course, we heard from U.S. Ambassador David Friedman earlier yesterday saying that contrary to negative predictions, the Jerusalem Embassy has, of course, been an extraordinary success. Gayle, your thoughts?
Well, as Ami said, the move of the U.S. Embassy has not lived up to the diplomatic potential that Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Trump anticipated. It's a symbolic move that is certainly satisfying in the short term, but it has not changed the rules of the game in the way that they had hoped and anticipated. In fact, when President Trump said that he took Jerusalem off the table, by moving the embassy, he put it right back in the middle of the plate. Attention has been drawn to Jerusalem, and in negative ways. Not only the European Union, but the Russians and a number of others condemned the move, and it seems to have boomeranged. The implications also for the attempts to reach some sort of peace between Israel and the Palestinians are negative. We can't take this as an isolated incident. It's very much in line with the activities of the Trump administration over the past year, but it's part of a pattern that has destroyed any credibility that the U.S. might have as a mediator and deepened the rift between the U.S. and the Palestinians.
Eran, what's your take on this? Has this damaged the peace process, or some say the non-existent peace process?
Well, quite to the contrary. We have to bear in mind, we're looking at this against the background of 8 years of the Obama administration doing its level best, and I don't blame them for trying, under the assumption that if they put daylight between them and Israel, this would actually make peace more likely. And the results were an utter zero. Nothing happened. Whereas here is an administration in very close coordination with Israel. True enough, the Palestinians are uncomfortable with that, but at the same time, there's a very powerful message. Leaving aside all sorts of diplomatic noises, the Arab world, even the Palestinian community, even the Palestinian residents of Jerusalem, reacted to this in a much more muted way than anyone ever expected. No volcano of anger, no eruption of anti-Americanism. Quite the contrary. There's a reason for that.
We, of course, have seen the fact that the Palestinian Authority has ruled out the U.S. as a legitimate and a fair broker for peace. We're, of course, waiting for this upcoming deal of the century expected to be released after Ramadan. Do you believe that that was an overreaction?
Well, I think they have a problem with the American administration moving the goalpost away from the fantasy land of UN Security Council 2334 and the Palestinian expectations that somehow Israel would be delivered to them and that the outcome will basically reflect the 100% concept of what the Palestinian Authority claims to be the only possible base. We are moving away from this. I call this the EKP. It's like the AKP, but everybody knows paradigm. The EKP has been the reason we failed to have an agreement over the last 10 years. We need to move away from it, and Jerusalem is a good point to start.
If, there's been a statement that this is going to be a reality check for the Palestinians, that they're going to see what the truth is. I think that what's been exposed is another truth, which is that the Palestinians also have firm positions. If your only measure of success or failure is the amount of violence, well, yes, there was not a violent eruption. However, we certainly have not seen the Arab states coming to support the policies of the Trump administration or I don't know what's in the deal. Nobody knows what's in the deal, but we certainly haven't seen them coming out front to support it.
Yeah, let me ask you this. Why do you think we've only seen so far one country, Guatemala, follow the United States example and move their embassy to Jerusalem?
I think that this exposed the daylight between the United States and international norms. It's another example of the way the Trump administration is disregarding some of the concepts and standards of international law that were set up following the conflicts of the last century. The biggest motivations for countries to move seem to be, as you mentioned, Ami, countries with large evangelical populations. Otherwise, we're not really seeing it in the interests of countries to move their embassies here.
All right.
So let's mention that Australia, even the Russians and others have already taken a step in the right direction in saying that they recognize Jerusalem, West Jerusalem, as the capital of Israel. This was against the international norm some years ago, so this is a glacial pace, but things are happening.
Well, I'd like to comment on that because one thing that they did was they made very clear that they were speaking about West Jerusalem, and that is in no way a wholesale adoption of the view that Israel, as it is currently defined, is going to remain. So I think that in some ways it's not the step forward that one would like to see.
Now, Iran, of course, we know that this is a very special relationship we've seen form between Benjamin Netanyahu and Donald Trump. We've seen some unprecedented moves made. The embassy move was one, of course, that followed the U.S. recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital. Since then, we've seen a slashing of U.S. aid to UNRWA, the UN organization for Palestinians. Then we've also seen the U.S. recognition of Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights. What happens for Israel the day after Trump?
Well, we certainly have to be very careful not to find ourselves in the coils of political polarization in America. Israel's base of support historically has always been bipartisan. And American politics, foreign policy, used to be bipartisan. It's increasingly polarized, and that's a worrisome trend, and Israel should do all which is necessary and possible to retain the bipartisanship of American support for Israel.
It's not bipartisan anymore.
Well, it's part of a very much broader phenomenon. I've seen this graph of how Congress used to vote in the 40s and how it votes now on a whole range of issues. And what used to be a kind of purple blob with red and blue dots has by now completely severed into a very polarized landscape. It has to do with some internal American dynamics.
But is there no fault here on the Israeli side? Some could argue that the Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, sort of gambled on the Republican Party throughout the years.
Well, I think he has kept some very good relations with key Democrats over the years. I would say I would put it otherwise. The Republicans have certainly made an effort to turn Israel into a wedge issue. To some extent, here and there, they have succeeded. But nevertheless, you go back to the core of the Democratic Party, the leaders of the Democratic Party in the House. These are committed friends of Israel. We need to be very mindful of that as we speak.
I want to ask the same question to you. And you know, by the way, Tracy, I remember during our broadcast last year at the event at the embassy, most of the guests here were Republican senators, and it was a very partisan event in itself. Gayle, what's your take on this?
I agree that the U.S. is getting polarized in ways that we haven't seen before on all kinds of issues. And indeed, there has been an attempt, mostly on the Republican side, to use Israel as a wedge issue. And I think that one way that that's being reflected is seeing who were the constituents for this move. And again, unfortunately, we come back to the evangelical community. We look at the speakers at that event, and it was not just partisan, it was religious, and it was religious Christian. The other thing that I want to mention is that in the past, allies have been able to count on the United States because of the stability of its system. You did not have policies, international policies, overturned quickly. Treaties that were signed in one administration continued. One thing that I fear may be a side effect of the United States decision to withdraw from the JCPOA with Iran is a decrease in trust that the United States is going to be a reliable ally in that way. And I think we're seeing a fear of the stability of the American system.
Well, I actually noticed that quite a number of America's traditional friends in our part of the world were very worried in recent years and are now much more reassured about American willingness and determination to support old friends. And in this case, the way the United States stands by Israel actually, very surprisingly, is reassuring to some of our Arab neighbors, moderate Arab neighbors who fear the pressures of Islamism. But I would say one thing about Jerusalem. Let us all be aware that the move of the embassy as a decision by the administration was basically in fulfillment of a law of Congress that was passed with a vast majority, most of it Democrats, way back. And when President Bush 41 took steps that seemed to question aspects of Israeli policy in Jerusalem, the U.S. Senate voted 100-0 to remind everyone that Jerusalem is Israel's united capital, and that's 100-0. No differentiation here between parties.
So now then, looking at the approach of the Trump administration, what we've at least seen in some leaked documents, of course, that were published in Israel Hayom last week, that there would be harsh measures taken against both Israel or the Palestinian factions if they were to reject the deal. Do you believe that the approach, the laying of the land, the trust-building measures of the Trump administration has been helpful or harmful towards bringing Israelis and Palestinians towards peace?
I can't comment on what may or may not be in the deal, but I believe that the actions over the last year have been extremely harmful. I think that they have succeeded in tearing down the Palestinians, not only in a practical way, but in a way that's somewhat humiliating. I think that things that might seem small, like the closure of the U.S. consulate in Jerusalem, are actually quite big, because the U.S. has just shut off its main independent reporting channel for Palestinian views. Now, all the views that U.S. diplomats get in their discussions with the Palestinians need to go through Tel Aviv. And that is a big change in dynamics. And it's as if the U.S. is just shutting its ears and saying, no, I don't want to hear you.
All right, well, I want to thank you both for bringing us that analysis, that insight, and both of those perspectives. We know, of course,